Greetings, this is Artie from Artifact Electronics. What you're looking at is a picture of the Oscar synthesizer. I became aware of this instrument about a decade ago. It was actually made in the early 80s by the Oxford Synthesizer Company in England. It was a single guy. Not a single guy. It was one guy who designed the whole thing, prototyped it, programmed it, and then he got some help from a friend of his, I think, in designing an actual case. And a friend of his drove it around Europe to music shows trying to sell these things. Now this is a hybrid synthesizer, and by hybrid I mean that the sound was generated both by analog as well as digital methods. At that time, synthesizers before the 80s were all analog, and then some digital started creeping in as the technology became available, but everything was pointing towards digital at the time. So this came out, and unfortunately it coincided with Yamaha Corporation releasing a purely digital synthesizer, which of course everybody wanted. Nobody wanted analog anymore, so everybody went out and bought Yamahas, and these kinds of instruments, there was no demand for it. They either got thrown away or put into the attic and eaten by mice or whatever, and people had a good time with digital. Well, some time passed, and the evolution turned around, because where we're at now is everybody wants analog. Digital is analog sounds much smoother. I'm basically quoting common belief here. It sounds better, the filters are better. So we're back where everybody's using current technology, but people are building synthesizers now that have full analog paths. Unfortunately, at the time this came out, nobody cared for that anymore, and everybody wanted the new bright shiny object, which was digital. Digital does sound a bit harsh compared to pure analog. There have been many advances made, especially filters. Analog filters sound great. Early digital filters sounded really horrible, but we've gotten to a point where there are virtual analog devices or synthesizers that basically have a bunch of DSPs, digital sound processor CPUs in them, and those filters have gotten pretty good. But still, everybody wants analog. There are things being reissued that were built 40 years ago. But back to this, the Oscar, I became aware of this. It looked real interesting. It was a hybrid instrument, and I was interested in getting one. And I looked at on eBay, and they were going for about $2,500. Originally, I think when they were blowing them out in the end, they were like $800 or $900, and now all of a sudden, of course, the minute I got interested in them, they were already on the rebound because of the analogness of this. And I found one on eBay. I think the bid was at like $2,500. I hummed and hawed a lot, but I put in my bid at $2,600 or whatever, and kind of hope for the best or the worst. That was a lot of money for an older synthesizer that was rumored to be not of the best quality, but you know how it goes. You want something, you can't get it, and you go bananas getting it, or going about getting it. Needless to say, I was outbid by 3 people. It went for about $3,000. And not only was that really expensive, but these things wouldn't show up anymore. So I thought, hey, I got to get me one of these. I didn't even know anybody who had one. I had never seen one in real life. I had never touched one in real life. It is actually pretty ugly. The panel looks cool, but it's got these rubberized end pieces and spacers here, and up to that time mostly synthesizers had nice wooden or Formica end pieces and looked a little bit more appetizing than this thing did. Neat thing about this actually is these spacers, which look kind of stupid, were put here. I mean, they're rubber. If the instrument ever fell on its face, these would protect all of the controls, which was actually a really neat idea. But needless to say, so I'm sitting there going, okay, and I can't get one. I don't know anybody who has one, which is, you really, it makes you really want to get one. And since I couldn't get one, I decided to build one. So here's what it looks like inside. I mean, I pulled these pictures off the internet. You can see here's all the pots. It's got basically two PCBs with a big interconnect, which you can kind of see peeking through here, which is the Achilles heel of it, because this always goes bad and the thing acts weird. But you get all these pots soldered to the PCB. A few ICs interspersed in here, but buttons, and of course the pots that came through the front panel. And on this side was the CPU and the sound generating circuitry. And this daughter board you see here is at about the time the Oscar came out, the MIDI standard was being finalized. MIDI standing for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, which was an attempt at standardizing how instruments from different manufacturers could talk to each other. So if you pressed a key on this and you had something else connected to it, it would send a message saying, hey, key down, this is the key value and this is the key velocity, and then the other instrument would play. And again, Yamaha was one of the first to adopt that standard, and once Yamaha adopted it, everybody followed suit, and instruments had to have the MIDI interface. This was a retrofit MIDI interface and with some memory expansion, which was mainly needed for the buffers when serial data was being transmitted or patch data or whatever. And basically it plugged into the CPU socket. You put your CPU in, ran some wires to DIN 5 jacks on the back for MIDI in, MIDI out, and MIDI through. And that was like the second Achilles heel, because if you have a board that is held in place by being plugged into a socket without any extra supports by screws holding it down, this is really bad news, because you got a CPU sitting here, and if this thing is shaking, if the instrument's being used live and abused, and it acts up real quickly. I know from experience that if you do daughter boards, make sure that you have spacers and screws holding it in place other than just the socket that it plugs into. But anyway, so this is what it looked like inside, and the next part was, can I find a service manual for this? So the quest began. There was no service manual, but I did find a set of schematics for it. You're looking at the filter in VCA, the voltage controlled amplifier, and of course the filter is a VCF, a voltage controlled filter schematics. This is all analog here. Well, actually mostly analog. You have some analog switches here that are being controlled digitally to reroute signals, but this is kind of what I got. It's pretty well readable. I mean, I looked through the whole thing to make sure that all the bits and pieces were there, which they seem to be. There was a block diagram. And here we have the digital control section. Of course, I noticed that, hey, it's running a Z80A. And I started looking at the parts, and the one thing that I noticed, I started making a bill of materials for this. And as I was making a bill of materials, I noticed that every part used in this was an off-the-shelf part. There was nothing custom in here. But not only was it an off-the-shelf part, that doesn't really mean much, because something that may have been off-the-shelf in 1980 becomes unobtainium soon. Most of these parts I actually had. They were TTL chips, the Z80 peripheral chips. But everything else I could buy from, I don't know, Mauser or Jameco or whatever was popular at the time. So I made a bill of materials and actually looked into the possibility of, can I get all of the parts? And the answer was yes, I could. I guess there was an A to D converter, an analog to digital converter, that was a bit hard to find, but and eBay a decade ago wasn't like it is today, where every part you type in, you get a hit immediately and a tremendous, and a horrible price. But I did find all of the parts, either in my stock or or I was able to buy one. So to me, that was the first hurdle, and that was overcome. Because if there were any custom chips in here, I would have abandoned the project because I wouldn't have been able to get them. So that was the first thing I found that kind of opened the path for me building this thing seriously. After more searching, I found this. No, not this EEPROM, but the contents of it. The firmware for this, for the Oscar, was actually downloadable. The bin files for it, there were several different revisions, and that in itself also went a long way towards building this, because yeah, I could have built this thing, but if you don't have the code for it, it's going to take you like 5 years to recreate the code. But there I had it. I actually looked at the code a bit to make sure it wasn't bogus. I didn't spend a lot of time, just general time, to see, hey, does it fit the Z80 structure? Are interrupts and vectors correct in there? And does it kind of look like it's doing what it's supposed to? And the preliminary answer was yes. So obstacle 2 was overcome. And then I found this. The original manual with original creases in here. No, this is a printout, but whoever scanned this did me a big favor, because on this instrument, what I knew was there's a lot of hidden functionality, and even though, you can read it, what it says under the buttons and knobs, and it should make it clear, but it really doesn't, because the instrument isn't just a sound generator, but it includes an arpeggiator, a sequencer. You can change wavetables in there. I mean, the wavetables are only 128 bytes long, but you can define your own waveforms for the oscillators. And even though this doesn't go into any technical detail, an instruction manual is always priceless, because by reading exactly how to do something, it does give you hints about what the circuitry does. And there were a few things in here that were unclear to me, that even though they were explained, and it just didn't make any sense to me, but I started to disassemble the firmware on this, and looking in the firmware along with this, I was actually able to figure out how everything was supposed to work. Yeah, it's a backward way of doing things, but the code doesn't lie. At least the code for this didn't lie. And the firmware was 8 kilobytes. I think there were 3 bytes left over. Everything was used up. And anyway, from reading all of that, I got a much better understanding of what was going on. So the time came to go and collect parts and figure out how to put this thing together. Ladies and gentlemen, here she is. I would say a 96% functional Oscar synth. It took me about a year to build it. Obviously, I wasn't working on it continuously. Probably about $400 in parts, and that's on top of the parts I already had. For instance, the base plate and the keyboard here come from the carcass of a ARP Omni I had that had all the boards missing and the case destroyed, but the keyboard had kind of survived. I had to shorten it. So you can see these keys were taken out. I put a panel here and just made a 37 key keyboard as the original had. A lot of the parts you see here are, God rest her soul, Radio Shack, the proto boards, the pots, the knobs. And when we were talking about off-the-shelf parts, even the pots used in here are standard value. These are pots that I was able to buy at Radio Shack off the shelf. 10Ks, 50Ks, 100Ks. That was about all it used. The case is built from an old bookshelf, and I even put the characteristic divider things, even though they're wood, they're not rubberized, and because of the geometry of this, they don't really make any sense, because you can't drop it flat on the control panel. But I thought I'd put them in anyway. They kind of divide the controls into groups. But let's go mobile on the camera so I can show you some of the detail. So here's the keyboard, nothing special. As I said, it was lifted out of an ARP instrument, and there's nothing, it's not touch sensitive, and it's basically a bunch of contacts, normally open contacts that get closed when you press a key. There's my version of the left side panel. If we look at the original, the left side panel has the 2 wheels, control wheels, and 3 buttons on it. I have some ICs on here. Here are the 3 buttons. And I didn't have any extra control wheels, so I just used pots over here. Same functionality. Then if we look at this, we can see the layout of the pots and buttons, which is pretty much duplicated. I mean, I start out with this panel that has some electronics on it, but then we can have a look at all of the pots and buttons, and they're laid out exactly the same way as in the original. I just printed out white sheets and overlaid them on the proto boards. Well, one thing to notice is the visual feedback you get from this instrument are very limited. You have the beat LED, which does do other things under certain indicate other things under certain circumstances, and that's another reason why you need the manual to figure out why it's doing what it's doing. I mean, this is obvious. You can set the tempo of the internal beat clock here. You can change the gate time, meaning how long is the key on. But it does indicate a few other things too, where it stays on solid, and that means something, and without the manual or having read the code I would have no idea. And then the major display device is this row of 5 LEDs. It's listed as octave. You can change the octave with the octave button here. You can go down, go up, but that's about it. This is truly a multifunction display. It does have several other modes of operation, which we'll have a look at. And again, this is obvious, the octave indicator, but some of the other functions wouldn't have been obvious. I mean, I needed the manual for that because I looked at the code and I could not figure out what they were doing with this. But the manual described it very succinctly, and we'll get to that too. Other than that, the wood case I spoke about, and very important, the electronics, which we'll have a closer look at, built using the most modern prototyping tools available, that is wire wrapping. Why did I wire wrap this? Well, the schematics first of all had some errors in them, and they had a few things in there that I really didn't like. For instance, there's a memory protect for the RAM, which holds your patches, and what that's supposed to do is when you're turning off the machine and the voltage, the 5 volts is dropping, you can get into situations where RAM gets corrupted depending on, what signal is still alive, is the right signal getting toggled or whatever. And there was a circuit in there that basically disabled RAM access when the voltage fell below, 4.5 volts or something, but it just didn't work. I couldn't get it to work right. So I replaced that, and we'll talk about it. I gave it more RAM and just generally changed a few things that I thought I could simplify. They are all in the digital circuitry. I didn't touch or alter the analog circuitry. Last but not least, we have a very simple linear supply, generates 5 volts and minus 5 volts. The minus 5 volts is necessary for the D to A or digital to analog converter as a reference voltage. And then we got MIDI in, out, through. We have audio out. Next to it is an audio in, which I did not hook up. And what I completely did not duplicate was it actually is able to read and write from cassette tape. But for most of you who have dealt with cassette tapes on computers, they're very unreliable, they're very finicky, and since this has a MIDI interface, a digital interface that can talk to a computer, you don't ever want to have to deal with cassettes on this thing. So there you have it. Maybe we can pop off the the CPU board or the electronics board and have a look at the wiring technique used. Well, here's a circuit board. Obviously it's not a PCB because there's nothing printed on here, but you can see everything looks kind of neat. I built this in stages. I mean, instead of sitting down and doing a marathon session and wiring everything together and finding out that things didn't work, I brought the CPU section up first, wrote some very simple test code just to test, see the memory access okay, timers work, all of that good stuff. Here's one of the changes I made. Remember I spoke about a memory protect for the SRAM, which I couldn't get to work properly. I used the Dallas Semiconductor 1210 non-volatile memory controller chip, which basically takes care of the whole thing. It monitors the voltage and basically makes the chip select line, blocks the chip select line if the voltage falls below a certain threshold, and never had a problem with getting patch memory or anything corrupted with that. There's a bigger SRAM in here. It's a bigger EEPROM. This is actually a 32K EEPROM. I'm only using the lower 8K, but theoretically I could put 4 different versions of the firmware in here and put a dip switch here to select which one I want to run. I haven't seen much use for running the older versions, but hey, maybe someday I'll write my own code for this thing. And this is mostly the CPU section. It's got a serial chip here to handle the MIDI communications. Got a lot more digital stuff and analog stuff here. This is almost all purely analog over here. And yeah, generally the more resistors you see, the more analog it gets. And that's the whole thing. Now looking on the back, here's what an endeavor like this looks like. And again, wire wrapping something as much of a pain in the neck as it is, when you are working off of non-verified schematics and you're making on-the-fly changes to your design, this is still the way to go. Because you can reroute, you can change addressing, you can change all sorts of stuff on the fly. And of course, you know, once you verified the design and everything, then you go and spin boards. But I haven't really gotten to that point yet. And don't know if I ever will, but that gives you an idea of what it looks like. Underneath. Does this make me a masochist? Maybe. Next we have the pot board. I call it that. It's actually a pot, button, whatever else board, but showed it to you before. Some of you may be curious, what does this look like on the back? What modern method of wiring did I use there? Point-to-point wiring. Everything hand soldered. This one took a long time. And it took a long time to debug. No, it did not work out of the box, even though it's not that complicated. You basically got ground and 5 volts going to every one of these pots. And then the wiper goes, the wipers are unique to each one. And the CPU just scans the pots, basically reads an analog to digital converter and does an 8-bit read. So you get a value between 0 and 255 out of each pot, and it just scans them continuously and then controls the music stuff. And then there's some rotary selection switches, which also you read them digitally as if they were several separate switches. I mean, the way they're connected is you read them all at once, and then whichever bit is set indicates what the selection is. The original ones were all 6-position rotaries, so you can easily fit that in a byte. Some of these have more. Some of these are 10s, but that's the only thing I could find. I couldn't find any 6s, but it doesn't matter. you actually know these are 6s, because otherwise you would be able to turn the knob past the legends. But they're a double pole, so I only used one pole. And these actually, I'm trying to think if those switches came from Radio Shack. And you know what they did? They had these in stock. Even though I had to drive all over town, because every time I found a store that carried these, they had one. And then it was off, to the next store to find one. Took me a couple of weeks, but I think at one point I basically cornered the market on Radio Shack potentiometers in the Salt Lake Valley, because they usually only had 2 or 3 of each. And I did make a false start with this, where I destroyed a few pots. So yeah, I went through a lot of pots. But there you have it. That's what it looks like. Let's put it back together. I put her back together. She booted up. And I guess the next logical step is to have a listen to see what she sounds like. But that'll happen in the next episode. I think we've done enough for today. Or this episode at least. So I would appreciate a thumb pointing away from the center of the earth. Leave me a comment and subscribe to be notified for when we actually try playing this guy. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you real soon. Now, in the comments section, I was thinking of or wondering if there's enough interest in me discussing the theory of operation of this, getting into the circuits a little deeper. So let me know if that's something you'd like to watch, and I'll get to work on that too. See you next time.